So today, thanks for Capgemini for giving us this space. But we're here today for the future of work. And it's a very different project than ones we've done in the past with these folks. We're doing it with actually Intuit. And so I'm Pete Leyden. For those of you who don't know me, I am the founder of Reinvent, which is a media company that works on bringing top innovators into deep conversations around to solve big, complex challenges. And the complex challenge that we're working on today is how do we really figure out basically what can be done now to ensure that all independent workers thrive in the years ahead. Now Intuit, who's our partners in this, they've been working with these independent workers for many, many years. A lot of their products work with that, and they are actually also very interested in this. And so we're aligned with them in this partnership to drive a dialogue, a really big conversation on what can be done now to ensure all these independent workers thrive in the years ahead. Now this is essentially the idea of the whole project. We kicked off in June with an event. Similar event like this. It was an evening event, it was jammed. We're gonna have a few more people coming in here later, but we're having some trouble getting them in here from Marin here. But we had a kickoff event. We've had virtual roundtables where we bring people from all over the country into these dialogues over roundtables. We do deep dive interviews with people even all over the world who have expertise in this area. And what we're trying to do is tease out all kinds of new ideas of what can be done now through the private sector, through the business community, but also through government as well. And so what we're going to basically do today is we're talking about the Treaty of San Francisco. And if people think, what the heck do you mean by the Treaty of San Francisco? There is this analogy that we want to explore today, that back in the mid-20th century, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but the short version of this is that coming off the war, America faced another big moment in an evolution of its transformation of the economy. And what actually happened in Detroit was essentially a moment where the business titans of that time, the tech companies, the giants of that time, came together with workers at that time, and they essentially cut a deal. It was essentially the way work was going to get organized and how the wealth was going to be spread for the second half of the 20th century. And it turned out to be the kind of formula that really drove a lot of what the middle class, the growth of the middle class in that period then. And so what we're trying to think about is if we're at a similar juncture, what could be done today in that same way? And so what we're going to do today is we're going to have a giant conversation with all of you folks here. We're going to start out, I'm going to give you a little framing to explore that analogy a little bit, give you some fodder to be thinking about right off the bat. But then we're going to basically have our first section here, which is going to come up here, including with the former two-time governor of Michigan. We're going to talk about the problem as seen through that analogy. What do workers need? What can be done now? What are the emergent kind of ideas that are starting to come out here? The second kind of section or hour is going to be what can government do to lead, and we're going to have Gavin Newsom, the leading candidate for governor here, who's going to be in that conversation. And we're also going to have, a little break after that hour, but then we're going to go to a third hour where what can the tech world do? And we've got some awesome folks from the tech world who are going to help us think about that. But here's the deal. We've got fantastic folks help us in this conversation. As I mentioned, Gavin's going to be here. We got Jennifer Granholm. Peter Schwartz is going to help lead that third section. He's a strategic plan, that's really one of the top strategists at Salesforce. We also got folks, so Cassie Devine from Intuit's gonna be here, Ahmad Mansour, gonna give some insights into kind of what his point of view. Catherine Bracey, Natalie Foster, Roy Bahat. We've got a great lineup of folks who are gonna help lead this conversation. But here's the thing that happens in these reInvent conversations. It's really all about you folks too. Everybody here was invited for a reason. This is an invite-only crowd. Many of you, if not all of you, bring some interesting piece of the puzzle here. So a lot of the day is going to be in dialogue with you, starting these conversations with these folks, helping start that conversation, but truly you're all in the conversation as well. The mic's going to get passed. You're on video. We're all on video. We want to keep these things open. For those of you that want to basically do anything on the live, we got live tweeting and things going like that. This is where the hashtag we use, Future of Workers. But to start out here, I want to start the framework here. Sorry about that. I should have warned folks. But no, I really want to set a little context here for about just a little bit to frame what this conversation is about. Because you can take future work and go in all kinds of different ways. And I want to get a common ground here where we're coming at it from Reinvent and also the perspective that Intuit had coming into this project. We're in a really extraordinary moment. In our politics now, we're an extraordinary moment in the country right now. And there's not just, so enough said about politics. We're polarized, we're paralyzed in government, and there's a really kind of an unprecedented thing going on in DC particularly. But we're also watching massive inequalities that just mounted over the last 3 decades to kind of an unsustainable place here. and to the point where it's actually churning up all kinds of political turmoil. Some from one side of the political spectrum that kind of was driving Trump's, but also all across the spectrum, particularly young people yearning for some bigger changes. To something has to happen in this economy. Something has to happen to shift the wealth differently in this society. We're watching it all over the world, though. This isn't even just a simple American phenomenon. It's happening all over. There's tons of trauma. And the way to think about why is there so much trauma? Well, it's actually that we're in a world historical transformation, a technology and economic transformation that is very, very rare. In fact, you could even talk about it as unprecedented in its speed and how fast it's hitting us. And that we're watching, I came here to Wired Magazine 20-some years ago, and we were just talking about these little computer chips were going to get bigger and more powerful. And this internet, kludgy little thing is going to interconnect all these machines. And here we are 20 years later, an incredible change in 20 years. And we're watching now, we're on the verge of AI, intelligent robots, all kinds of things that take it to the next mile. Well, of course, when you have that kind of crazy transformation in technology, the economic turmoil around that is going to be profound. And so what's happened, basically, is we've actually in the middle of a triple whammy here. We're porting onto an all-digital infrastructure. We're about a third of the way through from a global perspective. We're actually, at the same time, globalization is hitting a higher and higher levels here as we organize on a planetary scale, and we're watching the globalization backlash. And we're just beginning what has essentially got to be a sustainable shift. Most people in this room would agree with that. There's no way you can go through this without massive disruption and much political turmoil. And that's kind of the framework we're coming into with this. Now, out of this transition, we're watching the early stages of essentially an atomization of the economy. We're watching essentially now up to a third of Americans are independent workers. Independent workers mean contract workers at the high end who are doing great, gig workers, kind of middle, temp workers, at the bottom. These are people not in employment, but are essentially starting to kind of pull together the 1099 world. It's up to a third of the economy now. It's on track to be about half of them. Within 2020 is about 40, half very soon here. We're watching a huge shift. This is a symptom of what's happening as this shift. We're watching, again, on the horizon, even bigger worries as we really poured off a lot of different people from the old jobs as more routine jobs get taken by AI and robotics. So our perspective in this series has been there's a lot of good things about this transition. We're not coming out and saying, hey, this is just bad, let's put the brakes on, go backwards. Some in our politics are doing that, actually. We're actually saying the opposite. You could imagine this economy, this new economy is much more fluid, flexible, all kinds of things. From the business point of view, it's a much better way to organize people, organize work, not have to bring on full-time employees all the time, figure out ways to fill their time if you're not using them, all kind of stuff, getting the expertise you need at the same time. Many reasons why it's better from an economic standpoint, from that point of view. But honestly, a lot of the independent workers, the flexibility, the autonomy, the ability to kind of do what you love best, you can imagine that there's a lot of positives to this. This is coming from the people who are in these spaces as well. The issue is, how do you build the systems around that individual? How do we actually figure out a way that that individual can thrive as a worker in this new environment? Now, it turns out America was at a similar juncture, and we made this reference earlier. Coming off the war, we really had to reboot the economy from scratch in a new kind of way. We had to figure out there was this wash of new workers coming in, and there was this moment where we were going to build a different kind of economy. And there's some very similar kind of parallels to what was happening today. Now, it turns out back then there was a deal, and it's called the Treaty of Detroit. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. But what happened at that time was essentially the tech titans of that era, the auto industry led by GM, but also the whole auto industry, figured, you know what, there's a better way forward than fighting this out and trying to have battles and strikes and everything else going on here. Let's figure out a win-win solution going forward. And the workers said, hey, we don't want to always be fighting here too. Let's figure out a way that we can actually come up with a way forward. And there was actually a sense that they started to think, and this is not exactly what happened, but essentially the way we think about it is there's about 6 key things that a worker would need. You got to figure out how you're going to get income that matches essentially the cost of living. Can I buy a house, modest car, save for my kid to go to college? How do you get consistent work? You just don't want to be thrown out randomly. You need to actually have consistent work. How are we going to do that? They had to think about it back then. Healthcare. When there's different ways you could do that. They say you got to get healthcare that can support a family. You need a break once in a while, both from the worker's side. you just want to spend time with family, but also from the work side, is you got to get creative, get recharged. And you got to figure out at the same time how you're going to retire when you get so burnt out or you're too old, or you can't work on the assembly line, and ultimately you want a voice in your work. These 6 things, I think, are super reasonable. Now, back in the day, they figured it out. They basically figured out, okay, well, we're going to get you a decent wage, and there are going to be cost of living increases that you're going to be built into there. You know what? We're going to figure out a way. You're going to have a steady job. We're committed to you. Good times and bad. Or when you're off, we got unemployment insurance. You know what? Good health care. While Europe was going to government-run ones, they said, you know what? We're going to apply it. The employer is going to cover it. Your family's covered. We have it figured out. Vacation time, you know what? Everyone gets a break. The more you're around, you get more break. And these are not rocket science, but I want you to rethink how basic that was. You guys, you're going to retire, we're going to put a pension together, you know? We'll figure it out. We'll figure that way out. And honestly, a voice, you're going to have collective bargaining. We're going to actually have a way to talk. They cracked that model. And it was that model, and this is literally a picture from the deal. This was the Treaty of Detroit, when the labor side and the business side said, you know what, we're going to do it. And honestly, that cracked it for the auto industry. It was modeled quickly by the steel industry, and it went through the entire economy, and ultimately government backed it up, and all employers over a certain side had to actually have health care, the whole thing. And what basically was cracked was about a 50-year model. And it was really the 50-year expansion of the middle class. It started to break down in the 80s, which is another story. We don't have time to go into that. But the point is, there was a long run where it worked for everybody. And so the question is, if you're thinking now, at the moment of this kind of reworking of the economy, where would you look in the world? Well, you know, in this country, you'd say, wow, something's going on in California there. And I'd say, you know what, this state is actually booming right now. There's a lot of issues, challenges, but honestly, a lot of interesting things are happening right now. And particularly in the Bay Area right now, you're watching a phenomenal thing happening here. And so you say, wow, where would you actually go now? Not Detroit, not Washington. You'd probably want to think, how can we figure this out here? And so what we're proposing is, just as a thought experiment, what's the what's the analogy here that we could actually think through in the Treaty of San Francisco? What is the century, this generation, we got the millennials now, and kind of the GI generation. It's the biggest generation in American history. They're all of age, they're all in the workforce. They got 80 years ahead of them. What's the deal that's going to work for this century? So we got some interesting parallels. We have all these same 6 things. We got all those ways we know how it's worked before, but hey, pensions are unfunded. We know what's going on in healthcare. We can't even keep the thing going. You know, half the people are getting shoved off jobs and are on 1099s with nothing. We need to fill this out, folks. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to have a conversation of how would that work. Now, a few last thoughts before we get into this conversation. There's 2 forces that led the way last time. One were these tech companies. How can today's tech companies lead? And I just want to give you this thing. Blows you away. At some level, you say, oh my gosh, these tech companies are so powerful. It happens so quickly, folks. This is the top 5 most valuable companies in the world of the year 2001, right? It's basically the 20th century economy. Retail, finance, oil, manufacturing, one tech company coming off the dot-com boom, which was Microsoft. 15 years later, all 5 are now tech companies. All 5 are just charting out. A lot of running room ahead. 3 of them are in the Bay Area, 2 are on the West, others are on the West Coast. This is the commanding heights of the global economy. They got to start to get responsible. But it's not just them. In this room today, we got folks from Salesforce, Uber, Intuit, Airbnb. I mean, literally in this room here. And these are all giant companies with, you know, billions of dollars of market cap. Very powerful group we're sitting here. The second piece was, what can government do to lead this? And I think in a way, California has a really interesting opportunity here. The politics has shifted in California in a different way, and there's a longer story about this, which I'm happy to go into another time. But the basic thing here is that the 21st century hit here first. One of the biggest things was immigration. We essentially, in the last 2 decades, coming to 2000, absorbed waves of immigration. We had crazy kind of backlash, which is now happening nationally there. But what happened since 2000 is that. And we have figured out a way to accommodate that kind of racial kind of diversity, and we're actually, our politics is normalizing around it right now. One of the things that's happening, and this is, by the way, is exactly coming to the United States. It's just a longer time frame, and a lot of states are going to start popping here. We just are pioneering what everybody's going to be very shortly here. And one of the interesting things about this, just from a political point of view, is All the statewide offices are now Democrat. There isn't a standing Republican. That same thing that's resonating nationally right now and in Washington has been totally cleared out of California. It just doesn't exist. And also the interesting thing about this, look at this. This is diversity. This is our 2 women senators, 2 Latinos statewide officers, 2 Asian statewide officers, 3 white guys. I mean, in general, our politics is starting to absorb this. Supermajorities now in the House, which before were just stymied, and you need supermajorities to get taxes through and things, led by a Hispanic, actually, interesting. Same thing, supermajorities in the Assembly, same thing, led by another Latino. This is a state that's adapted to the future. And I would actually argue California is this future that is coming to the United States. Now, that puts a responsibility on us. Because I think with the leadership of the tech community and what could happen here politically, we could crack a model that, who knows, could actually have some longevity here. And at the very least, we should at least swing for the fences and try for it now.